Hey everybody, Michael Tracey here. Another podcast, number 2. Lots of interesting material over the past couple days, I have to say, in light of the Russiagate fever dream at least appearing to begin to break. This conversation arose from what else? A series of caustic Twitter exchanges between myself and Jordan Uhl. You may recognize him as a sort of all-purpose social media personality, I guess. He's a prominent Twitter figure, and as we discuss, he was a vocal proponent of Russiagate going back to 2017 when he helped actually organize something called the March for Truth, which was this nationwide series of marches and rallies basically promoting the standard liberal paranoid line on Russia and demanding investigation, although as we go into detail about, the investigation had already been launched at that point, meaning Muller had been appointed, yet they had this rally anyway for reasons that were not clear to me at the time, and we now discuss in hindsight. So I think this conversation is actually really fruitful because he and I had very divergent views. We had a lot of Twitter animosity, for lack of a better term, but we engaged in a really good faith discussion here and tried to reflect and even self-criticize. Jordan admits fault, which I sincerely applaud, for his complicity in helping to stoke the flames of the Trump-Russia conspiratorial fantasy furor. And as well, I also admit error in certain respects, which you'll hear. So I hope you appreciate this episode. Once again, please subscribe to the YouTube version of this show. There's going to be exclusive YouTube-only, quote, content in the near future, and then subscribe on Patreon. Because this is a very amateur operation at the moment, it's taking a little while to get the podcast indexed on all the traditional, whatever you call them, RSS feed things. I don't even know. Whatever people normally get their podcasts from. It's all going to be on there soon. It's just I've been swamped for the past couple days and haven't been as diligent as I should have been about setting all that up. But it'll be done soon. Anyway, enjoy this conversation between myself and Jordan Uhl. All right, Jordan. Hello.
Hey, Michael. How are you?
Good. So I'm laughing because the circumstances by which this conversation came about are sort of inherently absurd, yet also positive because I feel like people who would have followed our social media interactions over the years maybe would not have anticipated that we would have a cordial discussion like this. So
Right.
it's something to appreciate. How are you?
I'm doing well. I just saw that Us movie for the second time. It's great. If you have not seen it, if you're into horror, I would plug it. I like that movie a lot.
Oh, I'm not really into horror for whatever reason. I mean, there have been times when I've been dragged to go see horror movies, but I just don't like the sensation of fear when I'm supposed to be doing a leisure activity.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, because
But
it could stress you out. I took CBD before the movie. I understand.
yeah, I like when I'm doing something recreational, I want to de-stress.
Absolutely. Yeah, I get that.
But I others have different personality types or whatever. So, can you just briefly describe who you are? I mean, we're going to approach this issue in a very roundabout way, so there's no set structure here. So, I guess just briefly describe who you are and what you're doing now, in the terms that are most amenable to you.
So yeah, my name is Jordan Uhl. I live in DC.
By the way, I asked you to do that because I didn't know how to pronounce your name, and I didn't ask you prior to us starting recording, so I wanted you to pronounce your last name.
That's smart, man. That's clever. Everyone gets it wrong. Usually people say Uhl, which I think is the right pronunciation, but my family's always said Uhl.
What's the ethnic background for that name?
German.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have just worked in different progressive advocacy spaces and organizations in DC over the past several years. Done organizing, comms, video, kind of run the gamut, anything to kind of just like advance the progressive nonprofit space.
Right. And you've built up I would say a significant social media following since roughly the time Trump was inaugurated. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, that is. I've been on Twitter since like 2008, using it sporadically over the years. But in the 2016 election, obviously the outcome was frustrating to me, but also kind of like blindsided me. I just did not. So many people saw that outcome, like did not expect it. And then as I kind of like thought about it more and more, because I came from a Rust Belt city in the Midwest, like I kind of had a different take and was getting very frustrated with the narratives that were starting to emerge in the immediate aftermath, that like people in these rural areas and even like post-industrial areas voted on the basis of race, which sure, I don't deny that there are people that were race or like are like xenophobic and like voting because of like Trump's immigration policies or misogynistic. That absolutely exists, but I also think that it overlooks and erases like labor issues that I've known to have plagued my hometown for 3 decades.
And your hometown is what?
So, Youngstown, Ohio.
Oh, okay. So that's like ground zero in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were used for a
I was
backdrop.
there. I went to Youngstown for a little bit in 2016 when I kind of just traveled around the Midwest, talking to voters, coming up to the election. And yeah, I agree with your, synopsis there, obviously, but you would know better than me because you're from there originally. I'm from Tony Soprano's hometown in New Jersey, so I have different.
Nice.
Not quite, but close.
Yeah. So yeah, it was like taking to Twitter to talk about politics and vent was like cathartic in a way.
Yeah. So you made a conscious decision. You made a conscious decision, like, okay, I loathe Trump, which is fine. Lots of people in the country loathe Trump. I'm disoriented by this election result. I feel like I need to do something more, and part of that is going to be, enhancing my social media reach or just becoming more active and more assertive on Twitter in particular. Was that basically how it worked?
Yeah, I guess it was kind of like a form of slacktivism. Mm-hmm. At the time I was working at UDC Law School and doing like some like kind of I think it was a community outreach and also like comms and PR and video. And that school has a focus on like housing inequality, income inequality, helping low-income families in DC access like tax preparation services and also representation in cases against the IRS, as well as a few other things like needle exchanges. So it was like working kind of like in a local progressive space, but this just felt like DC really missed the mark. Like it felt in general everyone expected Hillary was going to win. No one really thought about the consequences, and I felt like because I had that tie to Youngstown and the way Youngstown and the surrounding areas voted, like they largely went Trump, that really concerned me about the future. I wanted to get more involved and didn't know how. I didn't have any connections in like the national progressive space, and just like took to Twitter, and it resonated with some audiences.
Yeah. Well, there's a paradox there because, the reason we're having this conversation stems from the whole dispute over Trump, Russia, and, Russiagate broadly, however you want to define this saga, which has been, as I think you would acknowledge, pretty dominant in American politics for the past almost 3 years. Yeah. So your compulsion after the election was to be sort of representative of this geographic region, which had a big political shift and enabled Trump's victory. You didn't feel like it was being portrayed properly either in DC progressive activist spheres or the national media or whatever. And yet, which is I agree with. I think a lot of people are trying to do that, some more successfully than others. Yet the Russia narrative was entirely separate from that. It had nothing to do with people's economic station, and arguably it was a massive distraction from addressing sort of the more structural issues which made people despondent and willing to vote for a morally compromised reality show host. So, like, if that was your impulse, how did you then transition to be a social media personality / organizer who was very much on board with the whole Russia thing? And we'll get into more detail about that, but you kind of see where I'm going.
Yeah. So it was kind of like thrust into like the social media space, and I'm reluctant to use like any sort of like influencer word because I just like vehemently disagree with like that whole concept. And I think that implies like that people would be looking to those people for insight and that kind of stuff, and I don't necessarily agree. I think sometimes people can just find like a feed humorous or entertaining. So meeting different people on Twitter and in like DM groups and that kind of stuff. And also kind of like following just the mainstream news narrative, right? Mm-hmm. At the onset, did not have the same kind of like information that I gained over the next like couple years. I don't know. I don't really remember like the exact nexus, like how I got connected with these specific people, but like I was added to like a DM group that was like largely talking about this issue because it was like if you're only following MSNBC, CNN, maybe New York Times, Washington Post, that was like the overarching narrative. So that's what people were talking about. And this is like
this was like roughly early 2017. Is that the right time frame? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it reflects kind of like a privilege and a level of comfort that I didn't personally have, but was brought into just because I was gaining a following on Twitter. And because of their privilege and their geographic location, a lot of people were based in LA, New York. A lot of people were worked in entertainment. This was their biggest concern. It wasn't income inequality. It wasn't healthcare. And maybe on a surface level, maybe an aesthetic, like they would tweet about that kind of stuff because like that was kind of what liberals did, but it wasn't a very real threat to them. So their issue was Russia. And I guess,
and let's just dwell on that point for a second because I think it's really incisive. So there are a lot of people who I think are well off economically, who don't necessarily, they might give superficial credence to the economic concerns of people out in the heartland, but it doesn't impact them. So they're sort of disconnected from the quote economic anxieties of people who were a major demographic that lifted Trump to victory. And a lot of these people ended up becoming sort of political hobbyists. So they ended up following Trump-Russia extraordinarily closely because there was always some new detail emerging. There was always like a confluence of zany subplots and bit characters. There's actually a significant portion of people in this country who are experts on Carter Page and George Papadopoulos. I don't think that was ever really a great thing for people to expend their energy on, but nevertheless, they exist. But the whole Russia thing was kind of tailor-made for people who are involved in politics just as a matter of a hobby. And if you're somebody who's in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, I don't know if you want to name any specifics, so that would be interesting. I could see why you would be inclined to like latch onto this particular narrative just as a vehicle to be politically active in the Trump era without actually addressing any kind of underlying structural political forces that brought about the set of circumstances that got Trump elected in the first place. You could kind of linger in this other kind of conspiracy fantasy zone or something and feel like you were accomplishing something.
Right. So I won't go into, I won't name too many names, but I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you that Seth Abramson was one of the most active members of this group.
No, I'm not surprised.
Another member, and to illustrate the point of how out of touch they were with issues that affected everyday people, and how this was just more of like an aesthetic opposition to Trump because it was fashionable. One of the high-profile members of this group tweeted something at one point when Steve Bannon was proposing a higher marginal tax rate. This person tweeted, "This is disgusting." And it's like I remember seeing it and thinking like, No, that would actually be great.
Yeah.
If they raise the marginal tax rate, that would be fantastic. But this affects you. You would have to pay more. That's why you're outraged. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. Like it was all because Steve Bannon proposed it. That's why they were opposed to it, and ultimately because it affected them. So this level of comfort and privilege, I think, incubated the Russia hysteria in this group to the point where people were saying like, we should do something about this. I was kind of young and naive. I mean, not too young, so it wasn't that long ago.
So how old?
Like politically naive.
Yeah, how old are you? How old are you now?
I'm 31.
Okay, so you're older than me, so you don't get any age-related excuses.
No, yeah, I quickly corrected myself. I guess like in relation to like what I do now, this was like my entry point.
Right.
Sort of. I had left the job at the law school when I we did this march. I'd already left, and largely this is probably because of Twitter. But I was like very motivated. I wanted to take on all issues, and people were like, oh, yeah, we should organize. We saw a lot of fervor about it, and also this was before Mueller was appointed. When we started talking about doing something, and it was largely Justin Hendricks and myself, and Andrea Halupa was part of it as well. So we're talking about kind of doing a decentralized thing. I was going to organize DC because I lived here, and Justin and Andrea were going to do New York, and then let everyone else just volunteers organize in their city. A lot of groups, I think like 20 groups signed on as co-sponsors and partners, and Move On gave it a huge lift. A bunch of other organizations. I can't even remember the whole list. But there's a critical mass around this from an infrastructure and organizational standpoint. So it was kind of like, as far as like the organizing, as much as I want to say, yeah, I like put in like the blood, sweat, and tears, it really wasn't me doing it after a while. It was just kind of like we got the ball rolling, and then all of these groups that had expertise in this area did the rest. But yeah, this isn't like largely like we started it, so I take like responsibility and fault for it as well.
Right. So let me just interject there quickly. You have these kind of post-hoc rationalizations going on and excuse-making where people are now saying, oh, you small little group of Russiagate skeptics. So there's this like journo caucus of Russiagate skeptics, including myself, who are now like even engendering even more hatred for some reason. But people are now saying that we always exaggerated the extent to which people cared about this, including Democratic activists, politicians, media people. Like, it's our fault that this issue became so dominant somehow. But what you're saying is that in this heyday of 2017, no, there was a lot of energy around organizing on this issue in particular, including from elements of the Democratic kind of institutional apparatus in D.C.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this was like Move On, CAP, free speech for people, I think Credo, but just kind of like a women's march, like the who's who of groups that are doing a lot of organizing. And for me, it was like, as I when you and I were arguing the other day, I was really trying to be conscious because Andrea and Justin see this issue totally different than I see it, especially now, but even back then a little bit. And I was trying to be very mindful of how we portrayed it, especially when talking to the media, because I did start to see a lot of this anti-Russia fervor, and I saw a lot of like Cold War tropes and stereotypes that I foolishly thought that we could avoid. So I was like very deliberate, and I just went back to check in preparation of this conversation. I went back to check and was like, what was I tweeting about at the time? And I remember Heather McGee from Demos went on MSNBC. I think we had worked with her at some point on like talking points and stuff, but like explicitly said like, this isn't anti-Russia, this isn't anti-Putin, like this is just about like transparency, this is about a fair independent inquiry, which was like our go-to talking point. But like it was a futile effort because the way the issue had been portrayed, even like foolishly and by like large news outlets. Remember like the Time magazine cover that was like St. Basil's Cathedral?
Yeah.
People weren't even getting the right building right.
Right.
It was just like, it was like pure lunacy. But for me, like at the onset, it was like, we don't have an independent inquiry. We only have like, we had like whatever committee Barr chaired, we had Nunez, like, the House and Senate intel and judiciary committees doing these investigations. Then Tim Mack from the Daily Beast reported that they were intentionally being understaffed. I think from a principle of like transparency, and government accountability, that was like a red flag to me. It's like, okay, well, if there's even like a claim of something, we should have like a fair like process, right? We should look into it.
Let me just relate to you what my mindset was at that
Oh yeah.
time. Yeah, so just so you can kind of empathize in a way, I guess. And I'm trying to do the same for you, because I feel like conversations like this are actually really good, and I hope people get something out of it.
Right.
At the time, I was never opposed on principle to an independent investigation per se. Because, I want accountability in government, whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. I feel like maximum transparency imposed on people in positions of power is always desirable. However, my apprehension was that I believe the Russia narrative was predicated on fallacies, and that there was no reason to believe that the conspiracy kind of maximalist interpretation that a lot of people seem to think was the case was true. And I always thought that they were using wrong-headed premises to justify their suspicions, such as this notion that all these, quote, Russian contacts and ties and meetings with Trump associates and Russians, they use that as a reason to conclude that there was something sinister going on. And my belief was that whenever you examine any of these suspicious Russian ties, quote unquote, they all seem to fall apart upon scrutiny, at least in the sense that they didn't necessarily indicate any collusion or conspiracy. They indicated, a combination of incompetence on the part of some of these bumbling amateur Trump officials and, political ass covering, because eventually some of these Trump people understood that there was this Russia narrative in full force, and they didn't want to egg it on, and they unintentionally did egg it on by not being forthright about certain things, such as when Mike Flynn purportedly lied to Mike Pence about his conversation with Kislyak, which ultimately was quote nothing burger, in that he wasn't even talking about anything illicit with Kislyak. He just didn't relay the fact of his conversation forthrightly to Mike Pence. So it's like a marker of incompetence to me rather than conspiracy. So this is all just to say that my sense was that if there was an independent investigation, considering the narrative was predicated on fallacies, all it would do was engender further pain and suffering and agony and conspiracy theorizing and just general lunacy that would suck a lot of energy out of U.S. politics and into this little hobby horse game. So that's why I never went out and advocated an independent investigation, because I thought it would have a lot of adverse consequences. Anyway.
No, yeah, I agree. I kind of, not to jump ahead, but just to agree with your point. I can see how you would approach it that way, and I can see how, because as I came to the realization later from being called in by a friend, the mission creep and how the size and scope was greatly enhanced as the investigation went on, is a little bit alarming, especially as if you were to consider if Sanders wins, right? Could that same thing happen to him, because he is also considered an outsider? And not to say that Trump and Sanders are similar in many ways, but just we know how political establishments work to cut against outside challenges. And this isn't to say that that's going to happen, but it is something to be mindful of. And I think that as that progressed, and as it it also was used to fuel conspiracies, xenophobia, anti-Russian sentiment, and all this whole gamut.
It ended up making a lot of prominent Democrats also look extremely foolish, in that they went along with the most extreme versions of this entire storyline, and now it's going to be used against them, and they brought it on themselves, frankly, including even many of the 2020 candidates who have now, given Trump a great gift, which is that he can hold this over their heads and say, oh, look at this, ridiculous quote that you gave in, whatever, July of 2017, then again in, January 2018, or however. I'm sure they've compiled it all at this point. And, he's going to have a very potent weapon to use against them.
Yeah. I don't know if you follow the account Data for Progress. It's Sean McElwee and a few other political scientists who just, just do analysis, right? Various different things. I saw one the other day. They were looking at all the 2020 candidates and how often they tweeted about Russia. And I think it was largely to dispel this myth that all of them were talking about Russia. And sure, some of them were here and there. Sanders was doing it a little bit more than others, which is a little frustrating. But like Pete Buttigieg, I think, has only once tweeted about the Mueller investigation in Russia, which was refreshing, but also reflective of someone who is working and has been in the Midwest for a while. He's a mayor of South Bend, Indiana, understands labor issues that affect the Rust Belt. So that kind of tracks. That makes sense. And it reflects to me what people in those areas that we need to win in 2020, if we want like someone on the left to win, like that's the kind of mindset you would want. You don't want them focusing on Mueller. You don't want them focusing on Russia.
Yeah, but Buttigieg is not, like you said, he's not in federal office, so he would have less reason to comment on it just by dint of that, whereas some like Sanders or Kamala Harris or whoever, they're going to be expected to make a reaction statement after, for example, the Helsinki press conference, right? Because that was a huge story and everybody felt like they needed to weigh in. Whereas, nobody was like on the edge of their seats necessarily waiting for Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, to give his take.
Yeah, right.
So it's just like
that's fair.
Yeah. So let's go back to 2017.
Yep.
This organizing that kind of sprouted organically through Twitter, which is kind of incredible in its own right. I mean, we don't talk enough about like the impact of Twitter. We don't know how to theorize it really. But through whatever Twitter stuff was going on, this group that launched the March for Truth kind of came into form. When did you first when did the seeds of doubt or apprehension first really begin to bloom, or when were they planted, and how did they bloom for you as this process was unfolding?
As I got close to the day, it was June 3rd. That was the day of the protest, and as it was like getting up to it, like I think 2 weeks leading up to it, just talking to leftists that I knew in DC, about politics in general, and kind of gauging their skepticism of the story as well, kind of helped keep me grounded.
And let's just interrupt so people understand. So just explain. I mean, I think we touched on it, but just explain what the March for Truth was. Sure. Exactly, just in concrete terms, so we have a reference point.
Sure. So it was a nationwide day of action. Very few were actually physically marches, but just it was much easier to call it that. So there's a lot of protests, rallies, that kind of stuff. Decentralized, largely grassroots, very shoestring budget, and it was calling for an independent investigation into the accusations made against the Trump campaign as it related to Russia, calling for an independent investigation. I think we had a few other demands that were like related to transparency, like a full open inquiry, like transparency related. I think it also had something to do with his tax returns. And
but just clarify this for me, because the Mueller investigation was launched in May of 2017. So hadn't the investigation already been launched at that point? So like, what was exactly being demanded by way of investigation if Mueller was already appointed?
We had a conversation about that. I in hindsight, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was like wondering if we should have just nixed it. In retrospect, I kind of wish we would have. But because I remember I did an interview later that day after. That was the only time I've ever been on MSNBC, and the guy was asking me like repeatedly, it's like, we have all these investigations and they just appointed the special prosecutor. How is that not enough? And I was like, admittedly, I was like fumbling for a talking point, because it was like, way more than enough. But like, we had all of this like infrastructure laid. I think a lot of it was like people probably didn't want to just throw away all the work they had done. It was very inconvenient.
Because the planning had began prior to Mueller being appointed, so you didn't just want to scrap it. Right.
Yeah, it was before. It really took off when Comey got fired.
Right.
So he was in there, and there was a lot of like concern and worry. When he got fired, I think that morning we had like 40 some cities signed up. We shot up to like 150 that day. Whenever he got fired, people then just became super engaged because everyone was worried about obstruction of justice then.
Right. So the day arrives, and presumably you're scanning social media and getting feedback and updates about various events around the country. What is your reaction to like what's going on in the various localities where these things are being held?
I mean, anytime you do something that's larger than yourself, you feel like good about it, right? I think like to take something from like to build something out of nothing. There was a feeling of accomplishment, but also like the signs and stuff. Even the DC one like really rubbed me the wrong way because like I'm a socialist. I'm a member of DSA. I didn't really appreciate that people were showing up with like hammer and sickle stuff because like as I told you like before, it's like they're not even like communists anymore, and like this has nothing to do with like the Putin administration or regime, their style of governance. It's just like this Cold War era mindset. So it was like I think it didn't really set in until maybe like a week or two later, like fully, but I was starting to see signs of it like then. But overall I was kind of like blinded by the immediate like aftermath. Like it seemed like it went well, no issues. My biggest concern was like something happening because you always know there's like troublemakers that can show up to different events like Proud Boys and stuff like that. And I just didn't want anyone to get hurt. I would feel like way like really, really bad if something happened, even if I had nothing to do with it. I would just feel guilty. And then
and nothing like that happened, right?
You and
yeah. So I'll get into that. I'll get into that.
Talked about the LA thing that I apologize to you for.
I'll get into that. So I went to the Los Angeles March for Truth, which was actually in March.
Okay.
There was a march, and then it kind of ended up on at City Hall in LA where speeches were given, and I went as in my capacity as a reporter at the Young Turks where I worked at the time, and I wanted to see what was going on, and actually talk to a lot of people, try to maintain a sense of fair-mindedness and charitability toward everybody I spoke to, but I reached the unavoidable conclusion. And again, just being amongst the crowd, talking to people without any agenda other than, admittedly, my pre-existing kind of skepticism toward the entire narrative, I could not avoid the conclusion that it was a truly deranged display of liberal paranoia unfolding before me. I didn't talk to anybody, and again, I didn't talk to literally every attendee. But I didn't feel like I spoke to anybody who was there simply on grounds of simple transparency or just kind of the most minimalistic version of what was being called for that you outlined as your motive, right? It was all very much conspiratorial, paranoid, people weaving together very elaborate theories about a collusion plot that went back decades in some cases, like the famous Jonathan Chait New York Magazine piece, where he alleged that Trump had been a Russian asset since 1987. I don't know if Jonathan's followed up on that assertion in the past couple of days. Maybe I should go check. But people would just give me very kind of bonkers theories that they've put together by, reading stuff on the internet, whether it's Louise Mensch. I actually talked to somebody who said that Louise Mensch was her main source of information, which was very disturbing. I thought those people only existed online, but, I saw them manifest in real life, which was frightening. And I was very off-put by it and frankly resentful of the people who organized it because I could have told you ahead of time that would be the result. So I went.
Oh, yeah.
So then the march ended up, we go to, at the City Hall, members of Congress are giving speeches. So, my journalistic impulse is to go and interview the members of Congress. So we interviewed, my camera guy and I, Ty. First, Brad Sherman, who is a member of Congress from Los Angeles, and then Maxine Waters, who was actually my representative when I lived in LA, in the South Bay, and basically Maxine Waters was giving a very how should I put it? She was taking a quote maximalist view of the entire Trump-Russia narrative, right? She was saying that Trump and Putin and Julian Assange and all these other guys were involved in this like racist conspiracy or something. I forget exactly what she was postulating, but it was a very, very much a far afield of, the more kind of reasonable version that you're laying out here. So I was asking her questions about this, and she got visibly agitated with me because I think she assumed that I was a right-wing troll trying to, get a rise out of her. Which I was not, but that's all right. I mean, I can understand why she might assume that. And then, very famously, she, kind of, brushed my hand aside or swatted at my arm, and I reactively tweeted about it at the behest of my camera guy, who said, yo, Michael, she just kind of pushed you away. She can't do that. She's a member of Congress. I mean, you're a journalist. You were asking her legitimate questions. And I was like, yeah, right. That was kind of bad. So I tweeted it. I should have paused. So here's where I'm going to admit error. I should have paused and more carefully considered my words, or maybe even not said anything at all and let the interaction speak for itself when it came out on video on YouTube later. But because it seemed so straightforward to me at the time, and because my camera guy was like giving me his own impression, I tweeted about it, and then people kind of latched on, and it kind of metamorphosized into this meme where they were saying that I was alleging that I was like brutally assaulted by Maxine Waters. And again, I get the humor in that because it's just like a funny dichotomy, right?
Yeah, totally.
But it's just like not what I said, right? I actually specifically said in that initial tweet thread, and people can go look at it if they really want to, that it was, a shove. And I shouldn't have used that word, I guess. I don't know. I'm admitting error. But I said, it was not violent, not assault, not anything like that, but still like not great conduct for a member of Congress dealing with the media. So sure enough, it became a huge, social media uproar. I got a lot of, I was mocked for it relentlessly. I was supposedly having a quote meltdown because I was responding to people, making wildly malicious claims about it. So if you respond to people who are like viciously misrepresenting you, that means you're having a meltdown. That's how like these things function. It's very weird. But
it's the hyperbole.
Yeah. But needless to say, I take responsibility. I'm somebody who's in the public eye to an extent. So the onus was on me to be considered in my word choice, and I did not do an optimal job. So I accept that, but I don't accept the kind of malicious distortions that then like transmogrified into this meme, which people still attack me for today.
Oh yeah. That's what happened. That's what brought up our conversation the other day.
Yeah. So like, what was your? Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. Just run on. You could just react to what I said.
Sure. As I mentioned to you the other day, it's definitely turned into a meme, and I think the hyperbole has led to like the hyperbole in describing it, like you said, it was like people are describing it as this malicious beatdown, which isn't true. And I did go back and check, and it's not what you tweeted about. But it's just like the hyperbole has led to other people believing that's what you said without even checking for themselves.
Right.
So it's just this shitty like feedback loop of misinformation, and that has just kind of made this joke perpetuate.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons why I honestly had a little bit of animus toward you, not because I knew you personally, and I always assumed that you were probably a reasonably, genial person. It was never about a personal, issue. Yeah, but it's, I just had noticed that over time you had, circulated various, stuff making fun of me about that, which is like, fine, I don't care that. No, I don't, it's fine. I don't care. I mean, I'm used to it. It's annoying, obviously, but I'm not going to hold it against anybody for like retweeting a funny meme. I'm sure I've done it a million times. So, but that's why and this kind of leads up to our conversation this past a couple days ago. I feel like I don't know. I guess I went and checked your feed just out of curiosity because I obviously recall you from that event in 2017, just to see what your reaction was. I hadn't really followed your evolution that closely, and I just had noticed that you even just a couple days ago retweeted some Twitter personality making fun of me for that. I was like, seriously, now of all times after this, I don't want to say I'm vindicated, but like people have said I'm vindicated, so after a lot of my suspicions and words of caution had come to fruition, even now you're going to go back to that meme. So it just annoyed me. So that's why I singled out one tweet that you had making fun of Maddow, and I don't, I'm fully on board with making fun of Maddow.
Right.
But I was just like, okay, this guy actually helped to organize. The massive series of nationwide street demonstrations that kind of helped to incubate the worst versions of the entire Trump-Russia, conspiracy, lunacy. So, now he's going to pretend like he's posturing as a skeptic. I felt like that warranted a full-blown onslaught on Twitter, which I did.
the Michael Tracey special. No, I think, and then I guess we could get into the conversation then if you want as well. But I could totally see how, from your perspective, that would be very frustrating because, like you at the very beginning, and I remember watching the video. Oh, yeah, to go back to the actual day of, I remember just going through all the coverage and stuff. I remember watching yours and Max's to kind of see, because I figured you would have the most critical. Mm-hmm. The people you guys interviewed, it was just like, oh no, like this is so not the narrative that we want. And it's like, that's kind of when I really started to feel guilty about the overall effort, because like, even though I do think we did the best we could to control our organizational and effort narrative, there's no way you can control the crowd. And because of the stuff that was being pushed elsewhere as well, we were bound to get people, like you said, like Luis Mensch, like Maddow, just MSNBC in general, all these different places pushing the Manchurian candidate type. Trump is acting at Russia's behest.
Yeah, like Russia had subverted the U.S. government and was using Trump as a pawn to enact a pro-Russia policy agenda. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say a lot of people sincerely believe that.
Yep, and probably still. Like even a couple months ago, Maddow was making claims about like Russia wiping out our energy systems and our electricity.
Yeah, so like people she was saying that Russia could like force people to freeze to death in the winter or something.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is like, sure. I mean, we're going to see at some point, I think, aggression on a digital front like that, like through 0-day attacks and things like that. It's not like far-fetched, but like using that type of stuff to further the Russia-specific narrative is so irresponsible.
Right.
Because there's no like evidence that that's going to happen, and it's not going to happen in this Trump-Putin conspiracy capacity either. It's like we have no evidence of it. So it's just deeply irresponsible.
Yeah, and you mentioned Max. That's Max Blumenthal, who also like covered one of the March for Truth rallies. The one he covered was in D.C. Yeah, and he interviewed a lot of people. One of whom was Jamie Raskin.
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, the Democratic congressman from Maryland, and Max just caught him in like total lies. I mean. I don't know if maybe not a lie, but like just outright misstatements of fact. And Jamie Raskin almost didn't know how to react because he hadn't been challenged on any of these claims before, and that speaks to a broader failing with the media on this issue. A lot of the Russiagate proponents and the people who were like espousing the most, again, maximalist interpretation of what Russiagate entailed never had any expectation, or seldom had any expectation, they were going to be challenged on their claims and like be made to substantiate them. And it seemed to me that like that was the first time Jamie Raskin had ever faced that scenario, and Max just kind of skewered him. I feel like I had a similar. He was more adept at skewering than I had been with Waters and Sherman, but I feel like Waters didn't really comport herself especially well, but of course it got totally drowned out and obscured by the one little, by the more, incendiary little meme part of it. Anyway, what was your reaction to the Jamie Raskin thing?
So I saw that like from a few feet away, but I couldn't hear what they were saying.
Oh, you were physically there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Max interviewed me.
Okay.
He and I kind of like got into an argument. And I think in retrospect, he's right. Like it was just the crowd and the stuff it was fueling was bad, and there was nothing that we could do from an organizational perspective to stop it, other than just not do it. Which, again, like I wish we had not. So him and Raskin are like getting into it, and they're like Raskin's kind of raising his voice and like kind of doing the whole like I'd love to debate you on this, just schedule an appointment and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
From his speech, I didn't hear, so you couldn't really hear if you were behind the stage. We had a little tent back there, and we had speakers facing toward the crowd, toward the Washington Monument. I couldn't hear everything people were saying.
My recollection is, correct me if I'm wrong, my recollection is that he claimed that Russia had hacked the French election, right? And Max said that, hey, the French intelligence agencies said there was no hack of the election. And I feel like that was the factual discrepancy that Max really caught him on, if I'm remembering correctly.
It was something like that. I think it was, he was like, Raskin was into hacking like specifically, which just that just did not happen. He also said something really weird, I think, that like Trump was the fake president, and like Max even asking him to explain that, I think, really pissed off Raskin. Mm-hmm. I think he just assumed it was going to be a favorable crowd, going to get people worked up. And also like Raskin's district is so blue, and it's like super wealthy.
Yeah.
To go back to the dynamic that I described before, the libs in his district in Montgomery County are like just the quintessential six-figure salary, home-owning, politics is an aesthetic. I'm watching MSNBC to get engaged.
And it's the same with like an Adam Schiff, right? He represents literally Hollywood.
Yep.
So it's the same type of affluent liberals who are these political hobbyists who prioritize this kind of issue, and Adam Schiff and Raskin capitalized on it based on the demographics of their constituency.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So for Max to come in with a counter narrative and even just like press him on it, like Raskin just blew up and stormed out. The only person I think Max was pleased to see was Linda Sarsour, who brought up Palestine during her speech, which was pretty great. Just not in any capacity related to Russia, just like we need to if we're gonna be progressives, like we need to address Palestine. Mm-hmm. He was relieved to see that, but he expressed his frustration to me very bluntly.
Right.
And yeah, again, in retrospect, I think he was spot on, because it was a nightmare.
Yeah. So I had a question for you that now is slipping my mind. However, I'm sure I can come up with it if I just kind of go on a stream of consciousness digression here. So what next? So the day happens, and where does the evolution go from there? I mean, I feel like, I guess you would probably have more conversations with people who are basically skeptical of the entire narrative? How does your posture evolve? Because here's what I wanted to discuss. So in my really acerbic onslaught against you, and I apologize for being overly caustic about it, but it's like years of pent up frustration, as I mentioned.
Dude, I get it.
Especially, there's a clip circulating around now of Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks personally attacking and mocking me for being leery of the Russiagate narrative and the clip. And I forgot about this clip, frankly. Some random person started circulating it yesterday. But it ends with him saying, Michael Tracey has blinders, and who's going to get the last laugh when Trump is marched out of the White House in handcuffs. So it was that kind of stuff at the Young Turks and elsewhere where, people, I think, whatever. So for this journalistic caucus of Russiagate skeptics, people are going to accuse us of, quote, gloating no matter what. And the way I honestly feel is I don't feel any joy about it. I feel maybe some contentment insofar as my discernment abilities were borne out, but for a long time it was not a pleasant experience. It was there were a lot of consequences incurred. And I'm not saying I'm, a victim of anything, but, a whole lot of hostility from people who had previously, been very friendly to me. They declared me intrinsically evil. They ostracized me, outcast me. A lot of social repercussions imposed, professional potentially. And again, I don't want anybody's sympathy, but I'm saying there were many moments over the course of almost 3 years where it was extremely difficult. With the culmination of that, it was never a sense of joy or pleasure for me. And I think people would expect maybe that would be the case, but it just simply was not. So I mentioned that on Twitter a couple times, and people didn't believe it, but it's true.
Right. Yeah. I think a few things like you can't have a good conversation. You can't have a meaningful, substantive conversation on Twitter, at all, about these types of things, because it's so easy for people to take even a portion of what you say and take it out of context, try to dunk on you. Some little fragment of your tweet can be used to kind of fuel this new alternative narrative or joke or meme or whatever. And giving into, I'm reluctant to use this phrase, but giving into kind of a mob in some capacity, I think it just doesn't really help. Even if you were right, I don't think that it I don't think that it can do you any good on Twitter. I think in general, being happy for what where you stood and as we see now, and also I am curious to see what the full report says if we ever see it, but assuming Barr's characterization isn't too far removed from what's actually inside the report. And I think you pointed out if it was actually still this big conspiracy, why would Mueller let it be characterized this way?
Right.
That it wasn't. So all of these things are shaping up to say this probably isn't going to shape out the way liberals said it would for 3 years.
Yeah.
So I think, spiking the football a little bit, especially if you faced professional consequences for it, being ostracized by people you were once friends with, being mocked by your former employer, that could really get under a lot of people's skin. I can't say I would handle it much different if I was in your situation. And frankly, I'm kind of relieved that I wasn't, just because it would be really frustrating. I don't know how I would have handled it. I don't know if I would have handled it responsibly. I think a lot of people would be very pissed off if they were in your situation. Now trying to shift the goalposts, move the goalposts, and be like, oh, well, it was actually the skeptics who created this problem to begin with. They were actually the ones obsessed with it. It's just
right.
I feel like I'd be very, very frustrated if I.
That's the epitome of gaslighting, right? And I hate that word, but come on.
Yeah.
And that was so for us. Part of what was frustrating about the Waters episode, it was if you actually go and watch the full video of my questioning her, the whole point was that I was genuinely concerned that the excessive rhetoric she was using and the anti-Russia antagonism she was promoting was going to have the effect of ratcheting up geopolitical tensions with a nuclear-armed state. And that is just inherently dangerous. I mean, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has the doomsday clock at 2 minutes to midnight, and they moved it even closer than it had ever been since the organization was founded at the height of Russia mania. So it was a contributing factor. So that was the whole reason why I was asking her those questions in the first place. And so for it to get totally drowned out because, I maybe didn't characterize whatever her hand motion was in the most, in the best way in the moment, that was just really frustrating to me and a lot of agitation. In addition to a whole range of other, incidents over the course of almost 3 years, which were of a similar nature, although that one was the most consistently irritating. So it's, I appreciate you putting it that way. I mean, I almost feel like if people think I deserve accolades, I would rather have them say so rather than me say it for myself, if that makes any reason, just because I want to sort of at least strive to maintain humility and not get full of myself or anything. In part because I really thought it was just so freaking obvious from the beginning, so I don't feel like I deserve credit for it because it was just that obvious.
Yeah. And this is what I was thinking about a little bit ago when we talked about earlier today. I think for a lot of people, this was just confirmation bias run amok. A lot of people hated Trump, understandably, wanted this all to be true just because it would mean he's out of office sooner. And they let that guide their wildest fantasies. Right. And the result was just pure bonanza. And I think that it's tough. Like I told you, I wanted it to be true just because I fucking hate Trump. And I think I want him out of the office. But that can't mean that we're accusing him of being a puppet for Russia, for fueling all of these different conspiracies, and then to have them trickle all the way up to a channel on prime time with millions of people watching. That is so deeply irresponsible.
Yeah, and it created this, again, sort of feedback loop where it trickled up to primetime MSNBC and CNN, for example, but it also trickled back down into social media where there are people like Seth Abramson and whoever who built a huge following solely on the basis of this issue. Because it's sort of tailor-made to giving all kinds of incremental updates and that people are deeply interested in getting for that instant gratification. And just to give you another source of frustration, when people in this, quote, Russiagate skeptic caucus, which is a term that I just weirdly coined today, I think, whenever we would express our apprehensions about this topic, inevitably we get flooded with accusations of being a Trump supporter or a defender or apologist or what have you.
Yeah.
And, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that literally every single day of my life for almost 3 years, I've received this accusation, as you could probably imagine.
Totally.
And so to have faced just an absolute avalanche of accusations to that effect for so long, and to now have it be the case where the people who were promoting Russiagate have actually empowered Trump and given him an extraordinarily compelling narrative that he can then marshal into his re-election campaign, and have actually validated the only grievance he's ever had in his life that's actually legitimate, that, that's kind of amazing, and it indicates to me that the people who were accusing us of apologia or defending Trump, actually had it backwards. They were the Trump defenders, quote unquote, all along. But that was just very frustrating to deal with for a long time, as you could probably understand.
Oh yeah, I think the kind of the media clicks, and I think this transcends just. I know you've been railing against Brooklyn.
Yeah,
I think this is just media.
I've lived in Brooklyn
general.
before, so I'm kind of I probably should not be imputing an entire borough in which I was once a resident. But anyway,
but yeah, it's just like they had a narrative, they had this their story set, they were pursuing it, and everyone who didn't agree was on the outs, mocked, derided, whatever. And that just like it just seems antithetical to like the premise of journalism that you're supposed to challenge everything, right? You're not supposed to take everything at its face. But
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned. I'm glad you mentioned confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, because I feel like part of what is within my constitution as a person that obviously informs my analysis in journalism is just a fundamental, ingrained skepticism, which I think is a worthwhile impulse to cultivate. Not to the point where you're just kind of a nihilist and you don't believe anything and you're just say everything's fake news or whatever. No, it's about empiricism and rationality and reason. So if you see confirmation bias and motivated reasoning run amok, and you feel like it's kind of coalescing into this narrative that's spiraled out of control and dominated American politics in very distorting ways, then yeah, you get invested in rebutting and counteracting that, as I did. And part of the reason why I've been railing against those Brooklyn journal creeps is that a lot of them now kind of want to posture as quote-unquote skeptics, or they say they never really bought Russia all along and it was never a big deal. And it's just like, okay, maybe if you didn't pay attention to it, but if you never had any stake in actually rebutting it when it was a risk to do so, then I feel like you have no grounds to now say, oh, I was working in a journalistic capacity, I had a media platform, but I never really did anything about this issue, and yet I want to absolve myself of all culpability for, I don't know, maybe I'm not explaining that really cogently, but there's just something annoying to me about people now, after the fact, trying to position as people who were kind of, doubtful all along, but didn't actually really say much of anything, while a very small handful of us actually did consistently rebut it and received all the intent and scorn for it. So that's why I've been railing.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. It's like, if you were to just kind of put that same dynamic in a different situation, right? If you see someone kind of like forwarding a progressive cause or organizing around a certain effort, and it's not politically popular and there's a lot of pushback. I mean, look at like the early proponents of Medicare for All and how they were like derided as like messing up a politically opportune time for Democrats, right? You're going to mess this up. You can't do this during Trump. We just need to focus on winning. And now it's becoming like the most popular health care proposal on the left. And now everyone wants to posture themselves as supporters when they were the same people who during 2016 were like screaming at Bernie supporters to shut up about it because it was going to mess up the election. It's frustrating. And I think this was very different because there were so few people like you and Glenn and like Alex Rubinstein is another one who called me in a lot over the past couple of years about like things that I might have tweeted that I wasn't like fully considering how that could like portray the investigation and stuff like that. And like I'm appreciative of him like reminding me of like how the size and the scope of the investigation was mainly one that we talked about, how that could be like a negative thing in the long run.
Yeah, so, there are some, and when I went on the offensive against you, there were, like I went and screenshotted some of the most damning tweets from like 2017, where you were basically affirmatively asserting the existence of collusion and a couple of other things. I mean, you're not alone in that. I don't really hold it against you, but that's sort of why I was annoyed.
Totally.
But what I said to you privately after that was, I am genuinely receptive and encouraging of people who feel as if they made a genuine, error, or not because they were ever malicious necessarily. I mean, they had good intentions, and I think you did, but it just went down a path that was not conducive to the type of positive change that you reasonably wanted to effectuate. So if you wanted to, I always said, if you wanted to make it public, not admission, I don't want to like dramatize it, but yeah. but if you want to like reflect on that in a public forum, hey, I would celebrate that, and I'm glad that you've done it.
Yeah, it's been obviously like what I know now about the story is vastly different than what I did in early 2017. And again, like at the time, I think the ones that you pulled the other day were like February, which I was still working at that law school. So I like didn't really know many people in media, didn't really know people in progressive like organizations or anything like that. So I was like solely relying on the media for this information. So it's very easy to fall into that trap, which like so many people did. And that just doesn't absolve me of like the organizational efforts, like with like the march itself. But like that's where I got that motivation and got that information from, which is, now that I look back on it in 2019, wasn't helpful.
Right.
Led me down a bad path.
So how do you kind of distill your sense of remorse or guilt or whatever the emotion might be? I don't want to overly dramatize it, but like, what's the kind of like the nutshell takeaway of that sense that you're now trying to reckon with to whatever degree you are?
So I guess every time I tweet something that's like critical or skeptical of the story overall, people get really pissed, and it's usually like boomers. Like it's just like old like resistance boomers, which okay, just y'all need to unplug.
Turn off the goddamn TV.
Right. Oh, that's another thing. I think what really helped me over the past couple of years stay away from falling into those traps, especially like falling back into it, was just simply never watching MSNBC.
Yeah,
I can count on one hand the amount of times I've watched it deliberately.
I mean, it's such a horrible mode of consuming information. I mean, I just encourage everybody to not ever watch cable news. I mean, occasionally, yeah, there's going to be a segment or something that, but you know, you'll find it through some other means. Just don't sit there and watch a full hour of cable news ever. I mean, it's just going to it's going to misinform you, not inform you.
Right. And I say this as someone who watches like Fox primetime almost every night.
Do you really?
Oh yeah.
What do you watch? I don't even know what's on Fox, not primetime at this point. I could not name you a show.
Oh no, I mean like Fox News. Sorry, like Tucker, Hannity. And
whoa! I thought you meant like you watch Fox Network TV and watch sitcoms and stuff.
No, not at all.
Right.
But yeah, I think that it's more from like an adversarial standpoint, just like what is the right saying, stuff like that.
Right.
But as far as something that would confirm my own bias or make it worse and make my worldview worse, MSNBC, I cannot recommend like turning it off and off.
Right. What do you think is the lesson going forward? I mean, there is presumably going to be some unforeseen controversy that, you know, bursts onto the scene in 6 months or a year or however long. I mean, we can't predict the future, but it would not be surprising if, you know, some kind of, you know, fantastical political controversy comes about that is reminiscent of kind of this ordeal. What's the approach going forward? Like, what lessons can be learned and what can be built upon to kind of create just a better media and political environment in your estimation?
Oh.
I know it's a big question. But...
it's a big, it's a societal question. Like, there's systemic issues there, but just like we drive the conversation on social, right? Mm-hmm. Like the way the media works is a bunch of reporters and producers just pluck tweets and embed it in articles, say this is what people are mad about, this is what people are talking about, and that kind of like drives the narrative, like getting stuff trending, focusing on healthcare, focusing on income inequality, showing there isn't an audience for this story. And this isn't to say that in general, like stories regarding transparency and accountability are inherently like not worthwhile, but like I think the story isn't all it was cracked up to be. It's not all it was cracked up to be. So pushing media to cover instances where the healthcare system in this country has failed people, where people are rationing their insulin, and if they can't afford it, they die. Like, these are real everyday issues that are affecting people that get a fraction of the coverage. And when I tweet the Maddow tweet that you brought up earlier, when I tweeted what's she going to talk about now, a lot of people quickly went into, I think there's 20 other investigations or whatever.
Yeah.
I swear to God, if she goes into all of those.
Of course she is. Are you kidding? I mean, how could she not?
Right. She's put too much time and effort into it.
And that's the thing. There's going to be like this group of dead enders, right, who won't let it go. And it's just going to prolong the pain. I mean, Adam Schiff, I just saw today, did some kind of dramatic, rant in Congress where he, basically would not admit fault in the slightest. And then you have, the Southern District of New York truthers. And yeah, I mean, there are more ongoing investigations, but right, Mueller affirmatively and proactively dispelled the central impetus for the special counsel investigation by saying not just that there was no evidence for, or not sufficient evidence to charge a conspiracy, he proactively asserted that there was no conspiracy. So he took an additional declaratory step. And it's just like, if that's not sufficient for you, then, I mean, you're just going to be going down this road forever because there's always going to be some potential loose end to, become fixated on, whether it's congressional investigations or whatever. And I just don't, I feel like people are so emotionally invested in this, I don't know how you can get them to detach from it, especially if they thought that, again, it's sort of like an existential crisis for a lot of people because the way that they organized their perceptions of the entire American political scene for 3 years has just been shattered. And I honestly don't know what the route forward is in terms of, tamping down that sort of fever dream.
I mean, people have made careers out of it. What's Seth Abramson going to do now? Like, go back to writing poems about, like, Elliot Rodger? Like, I'm so curious. Wait, what?
Wait, did he seriously write poems about Elliot Rodger?
He took Elliot Rodger's manifesto and, like, rearranged it into a poem. Because he was a poetry professor turned legal expert.
Yeah, I remember he had some, like, deep textual, like, metaphorical analysis of why Bernie Sanders was actually ahead in the delegate count in 2016. Remember that?
Yeah, he was like an H.A. Goodman guy.
Yeah.
Like, every single thing, Bernie was still possible.
It's so weird with that guy because, like, people, occasionally I'll get somebody on Twitter, like, challenging me to debate him or something. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll debate him. But then I go and look at what he's writing, and it's almost as if it's in a different language. Like, I almost can't, it's almost like not intelligible. I mean, it's in English in complete sentences, but there's something about it that just doesn't quite register because he's, like, on some different level. Not in a good way.
It's like a soap opera. Like, there's so many, like, storylines. There's so much backstory. Right. To the casual observer now, you're not going to know, like, the full context of what he's saying. It's kind of like wrestling also. And I remember Paul Bless, I think, wrote it, who's at Splinter now. But, like, Seth's big, like, first, like, groundbreaking thing, his first thread that really made waves, was this whole thing about how the Trump campaign rescheduled or relocated an event to a Russia-linked hotel or event space, despite their ballroom being smaller and holding a smaller capacity. But this was clearly linked, and then there was important meetings with a Russian ambassador there with Trump campaign officials, and it was the Mayflower Hotel in D.C. with moved to. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I remember that.
The whole thing was wrong because the hotel where they had it was bigger than the other one. It was just like the whole thing was predicated on a lie, and that paved the way for where he is now. So at the very onset, it was misinformation.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, it's just like, what could he possibly do now? I mean, you're right. I don't know what the pivot would be at this point. It's the same with Marcy Wheeler. I mean, she's now saying that, because she dangled this little, she's been dangling these cryptic hints about her having private information that vindicated her belief in a Trump-Russia conspiracy that would come out eventually. So she would say, wait, just wait, it'll come out, and in the form of the Muller indictment, that would, result in John Jr. and Jared being hauled off into a dungeon or something. And sure enough, there was nothing that, affirmed what Marcy had been saying for so long. And now she just did an interview with Bob Wright on Blogging Heads, and or a dialogue, and she said she conceded that the FBI, whom she proactively cooperated with, so she burned a source to the FBI, which is like a massive journalistic breach under any other circumstance, but she got celebrated for it in the Washington Post and everywhere else. It was some kind of heroic act without even really probing her reasoning for doing so. And now she finally admitted that the FBI might have just determined that she was crazy. I mean, that's what she said. And I said, you know what? That sounds plausible, no offense. And I feel like there are a lot of people who are in a similar situation where they created this kind of self-guided narrative for themselves where they had somehow a personal stake or like personal bombshell information that, authenticated this wider Trump-Russia, thesis somehow. And it's just very weird. And it'll take a lot of personal strife for them to actively disengage from it.
Yeah. Seth, I don't know if Seth ever claimed he had inside information, but he definitely acted like he had connected the dots that no one else had through what he calls curatorial journalism, which I think is just known in journalism as aggregation.
Right.
But that was his
it's just blogging. Like in 2008, it would have just been like blogging, right?
Right. The other ones, they're just not even worth going into, but Louise Mensch and Claude Taylor always claimed they had inside sources. Right. People kind of adjacent to them did. But yeah, they've got nothing. There was one lady, she ran for Congress in Florida. Her husband, I can't remember his name, was a former congressman.
Dina Grayson, right?
Dina Grayson.
Yeah. Alan Grayson. Alan Grayson was the big progressive firebrand in Congress for a number of years. And now his wife is tried to capitalize on that to become a collision truther.
Yeah, she even went to the Cohen hearing, which was and she was doing these overly animated facial expressions. She was sitting right behind him, and she was overly animated the entire time in hopes of, I guess, becoming a meme, and was constantly retweeting everyone who was who's the lady behind Cohen? And I remember it got to the point where they were asking him very pointed questions, getting him on the record, did X, Y, and Z, these concrete things that would be illegal, did this happen? And I remember there was one where he was just no, Trump didn't instruct me to do this, explicitly. And she was very clearly puzzled and confused, because in her mind, everything was going to happen in that hearing. That was going to be Trump is going down, Cohen's a good guy now. And sure enough, she broadcast her reaction. I remember watching it with a little bit of glee, because I remember there was a tweet from her a couple years ago where it was my sources tell me that there's a tape of Don Jr. Merrily treasoning with Russia.
What?
Never followed through on that at all.
Is treason a verb?
Treasoning? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Yeah, that's really funny. So let's just kind of summarize here. We're going on for over an hour. I had a piece in Fortune magazine that went up today, and one of the points that I make is that I always wanted a rational and evidence-based opposition to Trump, and one that counteracted his worst impulses, and even potentially encouraged some of his better impulses, such as doing a diplomatic initiative with North Korea, which may now have been blown up, but at least the impulse behind it I thought was good. And it just seemed like Trump Russia writ large totally negated any possibility for that. And that I think is a tragedy, which is, I find it just depressing, and I feel like the reasons for that tragedy have to be elucidated, and the parties responsible for it have to be held to account, not in a way that's, gratuitous where you just want to be dunking on people or whatever, but, in sort of in the manner that we just did tonight, where people actually give an account of why they did what they did, and then we figure out the best way to move forward. And that's my guiding impulse right now. And I just the scope of the media failure is just breathtaking. You might have read the Matt Taibbi piece from a couple of days ago where he likened it to weapons of mass destruction, and people got really upset because obviously the Iraq War caused far more actual death and destruction than Trump Russia ever did. I mean, nobody disputes that. His point was that it's the scale of the media error that is comparable. So with such a massive failure on that level, yeah, it's going to take a lot of time and hard and work to get to the bottom of it. But if we don't, I feel like it would be morally wrong to not at least attempt to do that, because that means something like this is just inevitably going to come along again. And so, I just that's all. Which is all to say, I applaud you in particular for doing this and saying what you've said. I actually, genuinely admire it. Not a lot of people, I think, would be willing to do that. What you've done. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Well, thanks. I don't want to pat myself on the back because I also didn't have a lot to lose professionally.
Right.
So admittedly, it was much easier for me to be like, oh no, I was definitely wrong on that story, because I was largely an observer. But as far as the protest, that was a one-time thing that came and went. So it wasn't like I had 3 years of reporting
right.
That I needed to back up and double down on. So it's definitely easier, but again, I guess I think as we mentioned before we started recording, it's not fun to admit you were wrong, right?
Right.
It's a pride thing for a lot of people. But I think after we had our argument the other day, I told you I also just don't take myself very seriously, so it's a little bit easy for me to admit when I fuck up.
Yeah, I don't particularly take myself seriously either, which people who I guess follow me on social media would not believe for 1 second. But it actually is true. I tend to be somewhat lighthearted and even a little bit,
right,
good humored. But people, I think, might be shocked to hear that.
Yeah, anyway. How do you convey that on Twitter, You can't.
Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. So, yeah, this is a great conversation. Any final thoughts, or have we covered it, I think?
No, yeah, I think we touched all our bases.
All right. Very good. Well, Jordan, once again, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, take care. Okay, that does it. Thanks again for listening. Hope you were edified. Once again, please subscribe on Patreon. Subscribe on YouTube. If you don't want to financially contribute via Patreon, there are other methods available, namely PayPal. Whatever, I don't want to hammer that point, but I think it is important to emphasize that the Trump-Russia debacle highlights to an extraordinarily painful degree how necessary independent journalism and commentary and analysis is. So if you agree with that statement, you should pay for it if you have the means. So I'll leave it there. See you next time.